Welcome to the Podcast Growth Show. Next level thinking on how to increase your podcast subscriber base. So welcome to episode 1 of the Podcast Growth Show. As you know, in season 1, we're talking about the basics of how to promote your podcast, the top strategies, tactics, and common mistakes. And in this, our first episode, we're going to talk about submitting your shows to the most important podcast directories. Now, what I'm hoping you'll get out of this first episode are a couple of things. If you are a new podcaster, please go and visit our show notes at podcastgrowthshow.com/E1, and you will find a downloadable version of this podcast marketing guide, and you will find the links to all of the directory entries where you need to submit your show, so that it makes it much easier. And I'm hoping that the directories that we will cover here will be the first and most important marketing step for you to take. And if you're a veteran podcaster, I'm just thinking this is a sort of double check or a checklist, because several new directories have come along in the last year or so that you might not have submitted your show to if you launched your podcast more than a year ago. So I'm hoping this will be a useful episode for both new podcasters, people who are about to launch their show, and also people that have had a show for a while and want to make sure that they are present and discoverable on the best possible networks out there. So yes, this is a basic marketing activity when you're first launching a show, but it's also one of the most important ones, and that's why I thought we'd start here. So ensuring that your podcast is easily discovered on all existing platforms is sort of a passive promotion method, but still it's sort of part of the launch phase usually, and it's also one of the easiest approaches that you can take, because it really just requires you to fill out a number of forms on some of the podcasting sites and directories that are out there. And what's a little bit different about the guide that I'm trying to put together here is that it also includes traffic statistics from SimilarWeb. So I've actually gone in and I've looked up the traffic stats using some of our SEO tools to the most important podcast directories. And what I'm hoping this will do is that it'll give us inspirations, because if you're seeing that there are millions, or in some cases hundreds of millions of listens or visitors to those directory sites, then it stands to reason that you want to have your podcast discoverable there. You want people to be able to find it there based on what they are searching for, keyword searches that they might do on those directories or on those apps that they download. Now, I've sort of developed my own little approach for this. It's pretty subjective, but I'm thinking that if a podcast directory has less than 50,000 visits a month, it might not even be worth submitting to, because as you'll see, the major players have millions, hundreds of thousands, in some cases, hundreds of millions of visits a month. And at the same time, some of the directories that I've come across and that I see listed in some of the more prevalent blog posts out there of directories to submit to, some of those don't get much traffic at all. And so I think that it's not even worth the effort. So 50,000 is sort of my cutoff point that I've arbitrarily decided on. Of course, the biggest one is iTunes, and that's just, that's totally obvious. And I'm just listing it here for completeness, but I'm also think it's the most important directory for a reason that some beginner podcasters don't even think of, which is that it is the root directory, or it is the directory that most mobile apps use to draw upon or to list your podcast from. So, for most of the mobile apps and podcatchers that are out there, your podcast is actually listed on those apps because they pull your feed, or they pull the directory feed rather, from iTunes. So you can safely publish your podcast episodes when you're first doing a launch. And unless you've listed it on iTunes and some of the other directories, that means that really no one's going to download it. So it's a good way to test, to make sure that your feeds are working correctly, that your website is working correctly, that your show notes are showing up, and that someone can actually listen to your podcast and subscribe via email on your website. And you can let weeks go by before then planning the launch strategy and by submitting it to iTunes. Now, iTunes submissions are handled via Podcast Connect, Apple's Podcast Connect platform. And it's basically just a matter of logging in and providing your credentials and some information about your show. So the actual doing it is pretty simple. Their submission process right now, I'm experiencing about a day, not more than that. And obviously their website is super popular, 224.7 million visits a month. Although I have to say that some of that, of course, is for apps, for videos, and for other activity. So in a way that's not really an accurate reflecting as a reflection of a podcast statistic. That's just iTunes getting a lot of traffic. The next one that we want to talk about and cover is Spotify. Spotify is a relatively new player on the scene, but it's been growing very fast. I mean, as you can see from the web statistics, it's almost as big as iTunes. And, they've only recently, in the last year or so, allowed podcasts into their ecosystem. And also the statistic for Spotify is a little skewed because there's music and a lot of other traffic generated that has nothing to do with podcasts. But still, pretty obvious that if Spotify has a podcast directory, you would want to be on it. So the submission process to Spotify has been up to this point somewhat obscure, just insofar as that you had to be with you had to host your podcast with one of their preferred podcast providers. So if you were hosting your show on Libsyn, which the majority of podcasts are on, or Blubrry, which is another super popular directory, or one of those major players, Spotify thought of them as preferred podcast or preferred content partners with Spotify. And so your submission process up to this point had to be one of actually applying to Spotify through their backend. Let's have a look at what that looks like on Libsyn, for example. So here, for example, is a show that we've launched in the past on Libsyn, and the way that they handle it is that they basically set Spotify up as a destination. And if I scroll down here, you'll actually see that Spotify is already configured, but you basically just go through the sign-up form, provide the details about your particular show. Usually this process of submitting a podcast on Spotify takes up to 2 weeks right now. Now, recently, they've launched their own podcast portal. And that means now you can submit your show even if it's not hosted on one of the big players. So that's good if you are hosting your show on WordPress or elsewhere. But there is a drawback. Your podcast analytics might not reflect correctly if you are submitting it from your own feed, because what Spotify does is that it caches your episodes and sort of temporarily hosts them on Spotify. And so that means that it can mess with your podcast analytics stats. And if you are with one of the larger providers, they've worked that out with the API connection between them and Spotify. So if you're on Libsyn, you're going to get accurate statistics. And that's why I recommend that, don't actually use the Spotify partner portal unless you have to, unless you are with one of the smaller or non-present podcast providers right now. So if you're with one of the bigger players, by all means, go ahead and submit your show through their process, like the one that I just showed from Libsyn. Okay, moving on. Stitcher is very popular. In fact, it was one of the more popular podcatchers and podcasting apps next to iTunes. And as we can see here, Stitcher gets about 4.18 million visits a month. Keep in mind that Stitcher is a pure podcasting platform. So that shows you how big they are. And so they don't have other music. This is basically all podcasting traffic. So you definitely want to have your show present. You submit via the podcast partner sign-up page. And by the way, all these links, of course, are in our How to Promote Your Podcast guide, part of the show notes for this episode that you can get at thepodcastgrowshow.com/E1. So go there and sign up to download this guide. We also have it as part of our podcasting resources guide that you can download on our website or sign up for on our website anyhow. The podcast partner sign-up page for Stitcher Radio just walks you through the process of creating an account there and basically configuring your show. You get to put in some custom graphics, and basically you get to pimp out your podcast homepage to look good. And I would definitely recommend going through that trouble. And once you're on the partner portal, you can basically configure your show, you can make changes, and you can get statistics about it as well. So Stitcher is definitely a very popular destination still, even though it's become so competitive and there are so many podcatchers out there. It's not as popular a platform as it was perhaps like in 2014, 15, 16. However, with 4 million visits a month, you definitely want to be on Stitcher. The next one is Google Play. Well, that's a no-brainer as well. Google has been spending a lot of time and a lot of effort in developing their own podcast app and environment. So they're very bullish on podcasting. It's rolling out a little bit slower than maybe some of us expected, but still, it is a super popular platform. And of course, anyone with an Android device, is likely to get a podcatcher through Google Play and find your show on Google Play somehow. So Google is a fantastic destination. It also allows you to do a lot of customization in the way that your podcast homepage looks there, and you do have to go through their approval process. TuneIn Radio has been around for a long time. I do think that it has some music traffic as well, but it does list podcasts and has listed podcasts for a long time, so it's a very popular destination. Their website gets about 24 million visits a month. No reason not to submit there. Same is true for iHeartRadio, another podcast directory that gets your podcast information from your hosting platform. So just like was the case with Spotify, the iHeartRadio submission process, if you're on Libsyn, is actually handled through the Libsyn backend. And I'm not sure on Blubrry, but you do have a direct way to submit your show to them as well. I'm listing that here in our How to Promote Your Podcast guide, and web statistics are about 30 million visits a month, so must have. And here's a different one. Or someone with a directory with a bit of a difference, and that's Blubrry. Now, when I first started, I thought, well, I'm hosting my podcast on Libsyn, and so it never occurred to me to actually submit my show to Blubrry to be listed in their directory. I wasn't even aware that that was possible until much later, and so you might not have thought of that either if you're on Libsyn or if you're hosting your podcast elsewhere. They actually get over 1 million visits a month, and they allow you to submit your show even if you're not hosted on Blubrry. So I made the mistake of thinking of Blubrry as strictly a podcast hosting platform, but it has a very popular directory as well. And so it's a good idea to submit your show there. And the same is true for the next one. Podbean gets about 5 million visits, 4.89 million visits a month. So very popular podcasting platform, but also a podcasting directory. And you have to create an account there. But then instead of submitting your own or creating your own and setting up your own podcast there, you simply submit your own show to be included in their directory. So that's well worth it. Spreaker, another one like that, almost the same amount of statistics, 4 million visits a month. They have a sign-up page. It's very simple. You just supply your RSS feed there and get your podcast listed on their directory and discoverable on their directory as well. PlayerFM is a multi-platform podcast app. It helps you find topics that you care about, and it also has sort of like an offline component. So 7.29 million visits a month. So that's a very popular audio listening platform. So do submit your podcast there as well. Acast is a hosting service again, but also has their own directory. So here's another one like Spreaker and like Blubrry was. So submit to Acast. It gets about 2.21 million visits a month. The sign up process is a little confusing. Let me show you a screenshot. So what happens with them is they consider this a non-hosted show, and that just means that you can go here and click on the Get Started tab to include your own podcast feed, and then your podcast will be included in their pretty great directory. DigitalPodcasts, about 81,000 visits. So now we're getting into some of the smaller players. Still a directory that I would submit to. Radio Public, about 378,000 visits a month. This is more like a hand-picked list on their front page. And my sort of approach with those is that if they are hand-picked and if they have a front page, your chances of being discovered and included in a smaller directory are actually greater. So that's one of the reasons that it's worth making the effort to submit to some of these directories where you may actually have a chance to be listed or featured on their front page, or at least have a better chance than you would on iTunes or Google Play or one of the huge directories. Listen Notes is similar to that. They claim to have audio transcripts of about 500,000 podcasts, and it actually translates or transcribes the podcast audio, and that makes it searchable. So that's an interesting approach, and for that reason alone, I would suggest submitting your podcast there. In most other directories, the keyword searches are limited to your podcast title, and in some cases your descriptions. And in iTunes, it's the author tag, but the actual content of the show is really not searchable. And so Listen Notes is a little unique insofar as that it tries to do that or automate that. Now, if I do a web search for my term, I would rather, of course, be found on my own website than on Listen Notes, and that's something that you would want to watch out for. Anyway, they get about 236,000 visits a month. And so that is definitely a place that you want to submit to. And now we're getting into some of the ones that are less popular. iPodder, GoodPods. These are directories that I'm seeing listed in other people's blog posts as directories you should submit to. But when I look on SimilarWeb, they don't even show up. Or they don't even have a mobile responsive site. So my attitude is that I won't bother unless it's above 50,000 or so visits per month. So I'm hoping that this is making sense to you. I'm hoping that you found this sort of walkthrough, a little checklist, useful. Again, for the links, just go to the show notes, because that should make submitting a show or double checking very easy. You just go through one at a time, see whether your podcast is present on any of these networks. And if it's not, and it has hundreds of thousands or even millions of visitors, well, just go ahead and submit your show. You can find those show notes on podcastgrowthshow.com/E1. We're at episode 1. Next time, what we will talk about is promoting your podcast by being a guest on other people's shows, and some of the ways to make that happen for some of the big players in your space, but also for some of the smaller ones. We've got some scripts to share with you, and are excited to get that going in our next episode. Until then, bye for now, and to better podcasting. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Growth Show. Visit us at podcastgrowthshow.com and download your podcasting resources guide.